Hello, everyone. I'm very proud to be part of this NetGlow 2020 session, and thanks for the invitation and thanks for selecting this presentation for being there. My name is Svetlana Bodrunova. I'm professor at St. Petersburg State University School of Journalism and Mass Communications. And my topic today is the boundaries of context, contextual knowledge and research on network discussions. This is more or less my conceptual contribution. There will be no clear research results rather than or beyond zombies. Long ago, over 6 years ago, we were doing some research on inter-ethnic conflict, on an inter-ethnic conflict in Moscow, in Birylovo, in the district of Moscow. And we have run into several tweets because we were doing this research on Twitter. We were running into several tweets speaking about zombies. Zombies in Birylovo attacking everyone. It's breaking news. They're everywhere. And we were very much astonished. Why zombies? And we then decided that someone was just, catching hype and eliminated those tweets from the sample. We were very wrong, because later on we realized that actually we had three major actors or actants within this conflict that we were researching upon and creating the network of the discussion. And these were zombies, vegetables, and cosmonauts. You can try to guess who these people were in an active interethnic conflict, which included bashings, people's gatherings, and very active action on behalf of the police, on the part of police. So yes, the zombies were the people that stood up and went to bash the warehouse where actually the vegetables dwelled, which meant the immigrants from Central Asia who traded fruit and vegetables. And also the cosmonauts were the police with helmets. When we study network discussions by the methods of big data research, by the methods of automated analysis, we study both form and substance of the discussions. In terms of form, we study links between users, structures, and hierarchies, formally measured influence, and discussion cleavages, measured in a formal way. And when we study the substance of the discussions, the contents, we study social representation and how it is shown up in the text, political representation, left, right, and beyond, psychological patterns, how people express their emotions, their gratitude or their anger or whatever, and how people unite or disunite due to this, for example, and the discursive nature of the discussions, how exactly people express what they want to express, how exactly people link to each other discursively, how exactly they reconstruct what happened, and so on, right? All of this might be studied in several ways, in several conceptual ways. And one of the major differences that has appeared there in within the appearance, or like together with the appearance of data-driven studies, is the division between theory-driven and data-driven studies. Data-driven studies, unlike the theory-driven studies, are based on the sort of running data, while theory-driven is the research that stems from the existing theoretical assumptions. It actually tries to deal with the data in the very traditional way, looking at research literature, at the existing literature, at reconstructing how literature actually developed, then posing the hypothesis, and so on. And data-driven actually says, let's run the data and see what it says. Let's be dependent not on the theory and hypothesis, but on the method that we use. And then we will see how the existing theories actually help us interpret the data that we receive or the results that we receive. So I would actually say that it's not data-driven, but method-driven research which says that, well, method is everything. And each of the approaches has its own advantages and disadvantages. Theory-driven studies are very thorough and systematic, and they actually provide for continuity in the lineup of the studies and in research history. But data-driven studies are actually amplifying science, or like extending science beyond possible imagination, because sometimes being strict within theory means that you cannot look beyond it, right? So disadvantages of one approach become advantages of the other, and vice versa. So these two can actually be very helpful in your research, right? And you will practically choose one of the two. And today, this is sort of a major cleavage between the two in big data studies, as people have noticed quite long ago, and also in the network discussion studies as a part of this, big data wave, so to say. And conceptual papers on social media studies, on network discussion studies, actually bring forward the same cleavage. We do see it. But I have always thought of this division, like several years I've been thinking of this division, and I felt there was something missing. And zombies, vegetables, and cosmonauts actually helped me explain to myself what was missing. Because neither theories that we employed that could predict to our mind what we could see in the data, what social groups we could see in the data, neither the data nor the data that we were running could explain what zombies were. Because when we employed theories, we expected in an inter-ethnic conflict to see the minority, the pro-minority majority, and the anti-minority majority. This didn't happen. These were not the main groups that were discussing this. And actually the data could not explain who the zombies were. We were looking both automatically and manually, but it didn't help. So what did we miss? Why we first cut it out and then we had to make zombies back to our research? Because of context. Context is the key element of any research design and understanding of your results. For several years, the scholars who deal with the network discussions have been insisting upon paying attention to contextualization of your results. Because big data sets have this aura of truth, objectivity, and accuracy, as Boyd and Crawford put it. And they create the feeling of all-seeing infallible God's eye view. So you see it all. You don't need a sample. You see it all, and what the data tell you will be the truth. But this sort of technological optimism actually might be very, very misleading. When you allow data speak for itself, might be really misleading, because anyway, you will need to interpret your data, your results after running your data sets. You will need to know what it actually means. And taken out of context, data actually lose meaning and value, as again, Boyd and Crawford say. Dana Boyd was actually one of the first and very consistent scholars in the area of network discussion studies, who insisted all the time on putting data into context. Starting from her PhD work, she insisted on that, right? And here are some quotes from Boyd, from Levmanovich, from Bruns and Burgess, from scholars from Australia, Axel Bruns and Jean Burgess, who insist upon the fact that social computing actually is about computational facilitation of social studies, assessing human social dynamics, evaluation and elaboration upon communication technologies that consider social context. But if we even all agree that context is very, very important, the discussion on how to employ contextual knowledge has somehow stopped in network discussion studies. We all know that it is crucially important to know the context for interpretation. We all know that we all try to employ context as much as we can, but there is no substantial discussion on how exactly the context works within research designs, how it interacts with the variables that we create, or if we don't create variables at all, which happens quite a lot of times in big data studies, how we actually deal with context if we don't have variables. And there's a whole range of other questions that I will try to raise within my presentation. And this discussion, while being almost non-existent in network discussion studies, this discussion about what context is has actually been there for like half a century in an adjacent area of studies, which is cognitive linguistics, critical discourse studies, and computational linguistics to some extent. In cognitive linguistics, the studies of context of message, user, the utterance of use of language, so to say, the message, the dialogue, discourse, and communication on the whole. All of this has had quite a long history of study, quite a long history of inquiry what context actually is and how it has to be employed for amplification of meaning. And in a wider sense, context is background for comprehension of anything in the widest possible sense. In a narrower sense, which is very often used in cognitive linguistics, context is presupposed common ground among the participants in a conversation, and this context and contextual interaction and the contextual exchange of knowledge comes within a discussion. So I think there might be a distinction between the context of the discussion, which grows within the discussion, and the context behind the discussion, which helps interpret what the discussion was about and how we need to understand various realities within the discussion that we actually scrutinize. And my topic today is the context behind the discussion, how we employ it, because a lot of studies of discourse actually say a lot about the context of the discussion. But I need that we underthink about the context behind the discussion, the wider context of communication. Three approaches that are actually named within the books about context and communication, which are provided by cognitive linguistics and cognitive science. There are the three areas that they define that deal with context and what it is. Textual linguistics. For this area, context is regarded as a tool for interpretation of linguistic utterances. The smallest possible context and even elements of such utterances as frames, maxims, whatsoever. It is seen as co-text, the cognitive environment for discursive manifestations, the immediate context, so to say, the precondition of speech. Van Dijk, though, Toon van Dijk, though, speaks about a wider sense of context, which includes the general knowledge of the world, knowledge about the current communicative situation, and mutual knowledge about each other's knowledge, what your counterpart knows. So this is, for me, an extension of this co-textual understanding of what context actually is, and we will look at it a bit later. In cognitive science, context is mostly understood as situational. It's mostly described as a situation of speech, which might include a lot of different factors, a lot of different situations, a lot of different understandings, and so on. So the situation of speech. But this, again, is not something that I am going to focus on. It is the context that evolves, the situation that evolves simultaneously to speech, which is context of the discussion, and is, again, the immediate circumstance of the discourse. Here, the context, well, actually the role of the context is definitive, because meaning is absolutely lost. It does not exist without this context of the discussion. But still, I think that situation is not the very immediate context, is not what I'm talking about. It's too immediate. In computational science, context is seen as an instrument to reduce multidimensionality. And this is where it reduces the dimensionality. It reduces the amount of options, the number of options that we need to consider. For example, like reducing the multidimensionality of large-scale data sets, which is very important for big data studies. Context is knowledge external to the task that a computer person needs to resolve. And this external knowledge is subjected to formalization, systematization, and I have found also another word, proceduralization. So how to turn your external knowledge into procedures that help reduce multidimensionality. And the overall understanding of context in all those three areas use this umbrella understanding of context as a limiting circumstance. In the discourse studies, context narrows down communicative possibilities. It lowers the likelihood of one scenario of a discussion and raises the possibility for another scenario. And actually, a bit counterintuitively, context might be seen very diverse, but actually it reduces the dimensionality of the research design by providing constraints on possible hypotheses and possible interpretations of the results. And when we say, let's put the results in broader context, it looks like we provide a bigger amount of understanding or a bigger amount of interpretations, but this might not be, let it not be misleading, because it might be. And putting results in broader context means that you actually reduce the dimensionality of possible interpretations by adding over your results some pre-existing interpretations or extending your results a bit by the pre-existing interpretations, but still very much reducing all the number of possible interpretations for your results. And I am trying to introduce this understanding of the discussion context as this external knowledge, which is still very relevant for the discussion because the discussion evolves based on this, or having this sort of in mind, but not immediately now, as not the context that rises within the exchange, but the context that shapes the overall possible directions of how the discussion develops. And we have several questions that we actually don't put to ourselves when we select the context, because we do it intuitively. We don't know where exactly contextual knowledge should appear in the research designs, or maybe I don't know, maybe you all know, and that would be perfect. Just tell me how context is selected within us, right? And how it is proven to be relevant, and how context is described and organized in a paper. We do have special sort of sub-chapters about it, subsections about it in our papers, but sometimes it pops up everywhere in the paper. Sometimes it pops up in the discussion part, in the literature review part, but I insist that we need to think about formalization of how we involve wider context in our discussion, in our research papers. My idea and my understanding after several years of researching on network discussions, my idea is that context plays an intermediary role in two major parts of the research design. One is between the theoretical conclusions and precise research questions and hypotheses, because you should not draw immediate research questions and hypotheses from the theoretical assumptions without assessing context, without assessing how in this particular context we pose these questions. And I think this is quite, banal and understandable. Then between the results and the added theoretical value of the research, because context allows you to clearly limit your input to the existing theories and say, this is within this context, but we don't know about other contexts, for example, or contextual interpretations might not fit into other situations in time or space, right? So context is a principal mediator between theories and data and back. And again, there are very important questions that we need to think about in terms of how we use context and how we don't destroy our research by using it. First of all, assessment of relevance. But here we have experience from cognitive studies that probably network discussion researchers should be looking at. And I don't see a lot of papers dealing with this, sort of formally assessing how they select context. And I would like to see more on this in the research papers, how you select what is relevant for your posing hypothesis and interpreting results. Then the three questions that I've been putting to myself all the time. Subjectivity. I see this is what was happening, but maybe my colleagues will see it in an absolutely different way. Data demands interpretation, and interpretation is subjective. How do we measure subjectivity? How do we allow it? What are the possible amounts of subjectivity that we actually allow into the discussion? Do we have a discussion on this in science? Reproducibility. How do we know that if context changes tomorrow, our results remain reproducible? Especially for network discussions, which are very dissipative in nature, very unstable. How do we ensure reproducibility? How do we ensure that context dependence of cases actually makes the research valid or reproducible at all? And also there is another question of case comparability. How at all do we use context when we compare cases? Because sometimes contextual knowledge is everything that explains the results, and what you see in the data is actually context that is looking at you. And in Germany, it will be one. In Russia, it will be another one. In the US, it will be a third one. And it's context that actually explains everything you see. And maybe you don't generalize in this case. So how do we use contextual knowledge to be able to generalize, right? So how do we use contextual differences to generalize? And also how we organize. Another question is how we organize the chapters, the subsections in academic papers about context. And my last contribution is that I would like to suggest for papers that deal with network discussion, the three different types of cognitive contexts, of contexts. One is cognitive context. The second is platform technological context. And the third is media communicative context. Cognitive context is the one that I was speaking about all the time, the context behind the discussion, which you need to take into consideration when you interpret the results, when you post your hypothesis. You need to have contextual knowledge. You cannot just go by theory or cannot just go by data. You definitely need this intermediary. As Van Dijk was saying, cognitive, social, political, cultural, and historical environments of the discourse. And you need to employ cognitive procedures of selecting the relevant context and describe it. Then platform technological context, which I see as platform affordances and limitations. And a lot of people who do research and network discussions on Twitter and Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, on whatever platform, actually, of course, describe the platform affordances and limitations that are introduced by Facebook, for example, on data collection, or Twitter on data collection, or API limitations. I see this as a necessary part that needs to be included in practically any paper on the network discussions, because this again allows us to sort of, see whether Facebook is comparable to Instagram in some cases and in some cases not. And I also insist that there is a type of context that was not discussed except for just several papers that I've run into in my several years in this industry. It's media and communicative context. And by this, I mean the following. First of all, the configuration of the media system with its leaders, political preferences, and divisions, because this matters as legacy media continue to be, as the research shows, gatekeepers within network discussions, gate watchers within network discussions, steps in the two or three flows of two to three communication flows and steps in communication. They work a lot as information providers, information disseminators, as bridges inside the discussions, and they matter a lot. They continue to matter a lot, and they are expected to become influencers within discussions. Then we also need to know that the discussion is a distorted mirror of this media context of the communication system in the country, because not many media will be equally represented on a particular platform. So you need to know how this divided, complex media system is actually represented on the platform, and might sort of intrude into the discussion and shift it and distort it, right? Then communicative aspects of not the media system aspects, but the communicative aspects, which is the nature of the discussion. You need to know what discussion type you're talking about, whether it's very quick, like burst out discussion, dissipating in several days, or it's a chronic, issue-oriented discussion that will be there in years, maybe in months, right? Is it ad hoc? Is it event-oriented? Or is it issue-oriented? Because this will shape the patterns. This will shape the network behind the discussion. This will shape the influencer structure, the hierarchies inside it, the divisions, and so on. Then you should know the social communicative context, the intergroup communication patterns, how you expect those people to talk between themselves. And you also need to know whether a platform is used by a particular group that you expect to see there. Because we on Twitter expected to see the minority, expected to see the immigrants speaking. But actually they didn't use Twitter at that moment in 2013. And this is why we didn't see them. Because they were there in the public discussion, they were there, but they were not on Twitter. And you need to know about it in advance, right? And then you need to have in mind the overall structure of today's communication. And I think one of the very important aspects of it is the dissonance and disruptiveness of today's public spheres. You need to expect that there will be no consensus seeking. You need to expect that your networks might be dissipative, might be disruptive, might be dissonant, might be very modular. And you need to have this in mind when you interpret your results. And I think that the scholarly community, especially those who study network discussions of like real world problems, we need to discuss how we employ context, and we need to exchange the ideas, how we employ context. And I'm very grateful to Nikita Basov and other organizers of NetGlow 2020 about context, and our own conference in School of Journalism and Mass Communications had to be on this. It had to take place in April, but now it's shifted to November. And I very much invite everyone who is interested in those aspects of contextual knowledge versus big data to take part in it or to witness it and to be our guest. Thanks a lot. Don't limit yourself. Be safe and healthy. Bye-bye.